Imagine waking up in the Roman Empire, the most powerful civilization on Earth, and realizing that the system holding the world together has suddenly collapsed. The laws that ruled millions, the armies that protected the borders, the authority that kept order across 3 continents, all of it suddenly uncertain. Rome wasn't just another city on a map. It was the anchor holding the ancient world together. Kingdoms feared it, provinces depended on it, and its legions enforced a stability that seemed unbreakable. But in 69 AD, that anchor snapped. In the span of a single year, the Roman world would burn through 4 different emperors as generals turned against each other. Legions marched on their own capital, and the empire descended into chaos. Emperors would be betrayed by the very soldiers sworn to protect them. Armies would clash for control of the throne, and the streets of Rome itself would witness the terrifying collapse of imperial order. The question wasn't just who would rule the empire next. The real question was whether the empire could survive its own ambition. Could the hunger for power among Rome's most powerful men plunge the entire Roman world into civil war? This is the story of ambition, betrayal, and a year when the Roman Empire nearly tore itself apart. The year of the 4 emperors. The year is 68 AD. For more than a century, the Roman Empire had been ruled by the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the bloodline of Augustus and Julius Caesar. To most Romans, that family wasn't just a ruling house, it was the foundation of imperial power itself. But now, that dynasty had collapsed under the weight of its own excess. Emperor Nero was dead, driven to suicide after revolts spread across the empire, and even his own guards abandoned him. His final act left Rome with something far more dangerous than a tyrant. He left nothing behind. No heir, no clear successor, no plan for what came next. In a system where power had always flowed from one emperor to the next, the sudden emptiness at the top created a vacuum strong enough to pull the entire Mediterranean world toward chaos. For ordinary Romans, this wasn't distant political drama playing out among elites. It was the terrifying possibility that the system holding their world together had simply vanished. For 100 years, emperors had been the center of stability. They commanded the legions, controlled the grain supply, and enforced order across 3 continents. Without an emperor, every piece of that system suddenly looked fragile. If the grain ships stopped arriving from Egypt, the 1 million people living in the capital would starve. If the frontier armies lost discipline, the Rhine and Danube could collapse under barbarian pressure. The fear spreading through Rome wasn't just about who would rule next. It was the darker question of whether the empire itself might begin to unravel. Into this uncertainty stepped the first man willing to claim the throne. His name was Galba, an elderly governor commanding legions in Spain. When news of Nero's death reached him, he declared himself emperor and marched toward Rome, presenting himself as a restorer of discipline and traditional Roman values. To some senators, that sounded promising. After the chaos of Nero's rule, an older and more austere leader seemed like exactly what the empire needed. But Galba's idea of restoring order came with a harsh reality. He believed Rome had become corrupt, and he intended to fix it by cutting away the expensive habits that emperors had used to secure loyalty. When Galba finally entered Rome, the Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers responsible for protecting the emperor, expected the usual reward that accompanied a new ruler. Every emperor before him had paid a massive donative, a bonus meant to ensure the loyalty of the men with the most immediate access to imperial power. Galba refused. When confronted about it, he reportedly declared that he chose his soldiers and did not buy them. In principle, it sounded like the stance of a disciplined reformer. In reality, it was a dangerous miscalculation. In the volatile politics of 69 AD, refusing to reward armed men who could make or break an emperor was more than a financial decision. It was a gamble with his life. While Galba struggled to secure loyalty in the capital, a far more dangerous problem was growing along the empire's northern frontier. The legions stationed on the Rhine were among the toughest soldiers Rome possessed. These men had spent years fighting brutal campaigns against Germanic tribes, enduring cold winters, constant skirmishes, and the harsh discipline of frontier life. They believed they carried the true burden of defending the empire, yet they felt ignored by the political elite in Rome. When the new year began on January 1st, 69 AD, the soldiers of Germania Superior made a shocking decision. They refused to renew their oath of loyalty to Galba. In a symbolic act of rebellion, they destroyed his statues and began looking to their own commander for leadership. That commander was Aulus Vitellius. He was not known as a brilliant strategist or a legendary warrior, but he had one advantage that mattered more than reputation. The soldiers liked him, and they were willing to fight for him. Soon the Rhine legions proclaimed Vitellius as emperor, and once an army of hardened frontier veterans decided they had their own candidate for the throne, the political struggle in Rome transformed into something far more dangerous. It became a military contest. Back in the capital, Galba faced another threat much closer to home. Among the men who had supported his rise was a wealthy and ambitious aristocrat named Otho. Otho had expected to be named Galba's successor, believing loyalty would eventually reward him with the throne. Instead, Galba chose someone else. For Otho, the message was clear. If he waited patiently, he would be pushed aside by other rivals. If he acted quickly, the empire might still be within reach. Otho turned to the same men Galba had refused to reward, the Praetorian Guard. Quietly, he promised them the donative they had been denied. Money, power, and opportunity were persuasive arguments. The guards who were supposed to protect the emperor suddenly found themselves backing a different future. Within days, the conspiracy moved from whispers to violence. Galba was seized in the streets and brutally killed in the Roman Forum, cut down by soldiers who only weeks earlier had sworn loyalty to him. In less than a month, Rome had already watched two emperors fall. Nero was dead. Galba was now a corpse, lying in the heart of the capital. And Otho had taken the throne through betrayal and blood. But the crown he claimed was anything but secure, because far to the north, the legions of the Rhine were already on the move, marching south under the banner of Vitellius. Two rival emperors now stood backed by powerful armies, and the empire itself was caught between them. The struggle for Rome was no longer a matter of politics or intrigue. It was about to become a war. In the dead of winter, the legions loyal to Vitellius begin moving south. From their bases along the Rhine, nearly 70,000 hardened soldiers marched toward Italy, forcing their way through the icy passes of the Alps. These were not inexperienced recruits. They were veterans of brutal frontier wars, men who had spent years fighting in mud, forests, and freezing rain along the empire's most dangerous borders. Now they were turning their attention inward, advancing toward the very heart of Roman power. For them, this campaign was more than loyalty to a commander. It was an opportunity. The wealth of Rome, the rewards of victory, and the promise of influence over the empire's future all lay ahead. While this massive force pushes through the mountains, Otho sits in Rome with a growing sense of urgency. He has the Praetorian Guard and several units of sailors, but his strongest legions are still far away in the Balkans, marching as quickly as they can to reinforce him. Every day that passes brings Vitellius's army closer to Italy. Otho faces a brutal decision. If he waits for his reinforcements, he risks allowing the enemy to reach the capital and trap him inside the city. If he marches north immediately, he will confront a larger and more experienced army with forces that may not be strong enough to stop them. Either choice carries enormous risk. In the end, Otho chooses to fight. In April of 69 AD, the two Roman armies meet near a small town in northern Italy called Bedriacum, close to modern-day Cremona. What followed was one of the most brutal confrontations in Roman Civil War history. This was not a battle against foreign enemies. This was Roman against Roman. The soldiers on both sides wore the same armor, carried the same heavy shields, and fought with the same pilum spears designed to break an enemy formation. Each side understood the other's tactics, the signals of command, and the weaknesses in their formations. The result was a savage and exhausting struggle. For nearly 10 hours, the armies crashed into each other again and again, shield walls grinding together as men stabbed with short swords and hurled their pila at point-blank range. Shields slammed into faces, iron struck iron, and the wounded were trampled beneath the press of thousands of boots. The fighting is intimate and relentless, the kind of combat where survival depended on strength, discipline, and the ability to stand your ground while the man in front of you tried to drive a blade into your ribs. By the time the sun began to fall, the fields around Bedriacum had turned into a wasteland of broken equipment and fallen soldiers. Otho's army could not hold. Vitellius's veterans gradually forced them back, shattering their lines and turning the battlefield into a chaotic retreat. Yet, the war was not necessarily over. Fresh legions from the east were still marching toward Italy. With those reinforcements, Otho might have continued the struggle and forced another battle. Many of his supporters expected him to do exactly that. But what happened next stunned the empire. Looking at the enormous number of Roman dead left behind on the battlefield, Otho made a decision that historians have debated ever since. Rather than prolong the civil war, he chose to end his claim to power. The following morning, he took his own life. According to ancient writers, he declared that he would rather die than allow more Romans to kill each other for his sake. Some later historians saw the act as a final gesture of honor, a ruler sacrificing himself to spare the empire further destruction. Others suspected despair, or the realization that Vitellius's forces were simply too strong to defeat. Whatever his reasons, Otho was gone. In just a few months, Rome had watched 3 emperors rise and fall. Vitellius now marched into the capital as the new ruler of the Roman world. But the struggle for the throne was far from finished. While Vitellius settled into power, another figure was already gathering strength in the eastern provinces of the empire. In Judea, a seasoned general named Vespasian was leading Roman forces in a brutal campaign to crush a massive Jewish revolt. Unlike many aristocrats who sought the throne through political connections, Vespasian had built his reputation in the army. He was practical, disciplined, and deeply respected by the soldiers who served under him. His reputation as a capable commander had earned him the loyalty of the legions stationed in the east. Soon, those legions made a dramatic decision. The armies of Syria and Egypt proclaimed Vespasian as emperor. That declaration carried enormous weight. Egypt controlled the grain shipments that fed the city of Rome, and now those vital supplies were effectively in Vespasian's hands. With control over the empire's food supply, he possessed a powerful weapon. He did not necessarily need to march on Rome to challenge Vitellius. If the grain stopped flowing, the capital itself would begin to starve. But events were already moving faster than strategy alone could contain. One of Vespasian's most aggressive commanders, a general named Antonius Primus, decided not to wait. Gathering the powerful legions stationed along the Danube, he began driving them toward Italy with the force of a hammer blow. Another massive Roman army was now marching toward the heart of the empire. The civil war that had already consumed 3 emperors was about to enter its most violent phase. By the end of 69 AD, the struggle for the Roman throne had turned northern Italy into a scarred battlefield. Cities were tense, roads were filled with marching soldiers, and the land around the Po River had already witnessed one brutal clash between Roman armies. In Rome, Emperor Vitellius sat on the throne, but the victory that had placed him there was already beginning to slip away. His soldiers, the same legions who had crushed Otho's army at Bedriacum, had grown careless after their triumph. Discipline weakened, command structures loosened, and the confidence of victory slowly turned into complacency. Far from the capital, however, a new force was advancing with dangerous speed. Acting in the name of Vespasian, the aggressive commander Antonius Primus was leading the Danube legions into Italy. These soldiers were hardened frontier veterans, men who had spent years guarding the empire's northern borders along the Danube. They were fast, ruthless, and eager for revenge after watching the chaos consume the empire. As they pushed southward, they carried with them the growing momentum of Vespasian's claim to the throne. The two armies finally collided in a place that had already become soaked with Roman blood. Once again, the battlefield was near Bedriacum, but this battle would not follow the patterns of the first. As the fighting began, daylight slowly faded across the plains of northern Italy. In most ancient battles, darkness meant the end of combat. Armies relied on signals, banners, and clear lines of command. When the sun went down, confusion usually forced both sides to withdraw and regroup. At Bedriacum, that did not happen. The violence continued. For the first time in Roman history, a massive pitched battle unfolded deep into the night. In the darkness, the battlefield dissolved into chaos. Soldiers could barely see the banners that identified their units. Commanders struggled to control formations that were now fighting almost blindly. Men shouted orders that were lost in the noise of clashing shields and screaming wounded. In some cases, soldiers had to touch the armor of the man beside them, feeling for the insignia that told them whether he was an ally or an enemy. The familiar structure of Roman warfare, discipline, formation, coordination, began to break apart in the confusion. Amid this darkness, a strange moment changed the course of the battle. Among the forces fighting for Vespasian was the 3rd Legion, a unit known for a daily ritual. At sunrise, its soldiers traditionally greeted the rising sun with a loud salute. As the first faint light began to appear on the horizon, the Legion performed the same gesture it had practiced countless times before. Their sudden roar echoed across the battlefield. To the exhausted troops of Vitellius, already struggling to see and understand what was happening around them, the noise sounded like the arrival of fresh reinforcements. Panic spread through their ranks. The fragile discipline holding their lines together began to collapse. Units started falling back. What had been a brutal struggle quickly turned into a chaotic retreat. The professional order that normally defined Roman legions vanished in the confusion, replaced by fear and desperation as Vitellius's soldiers began to break. The defeated troops fled toward the nearby city of Cremona, hoping its walls would offer safety. But the army chasing them had no intention of stopping. What followed shocked even those who had witnessed years of civil war. Cremona was one of the most prosperous cities in northern Italy, a place of wealth, temples, and Roman citizens who had little connection to the battlefield outside their gates. Normally, Roman commanders avoided destroying their own cities. Sackings were reserved for conquered enemies, not fellow Romans. But the soldiers who stormed into Cremona had marched for weeks, fought through a savage night battle, and now saw the city as a prize waiting to be taken. For 4 days, discipline collapsed entirely. The victorious troops looted houses, stripped temples of their treasures, and turned the streets into scenes of violence and terror. Civilians who had never taken part in the war were caught in the storm unleashed by the armies fighting for power. Antonius Primus reportedly attempted to restore order, but by then, the soldiers were no longer listening. The victory had unleashed something darker than ambition. The civil war had reached a point where Roman soldiers were now destroying Roman cities. In many ways, the empire was no longer simply fighting a war, it was consuming itself. News of the disaster quickly reached Rome. Panic spread through the capital as reports arrived describing the destruction of Cremona and the relentless advance of Vespasian's forces. The illusion that Vitellius still controlled the situation began to crumble. Even he seemed to understand that his position was becoming impossible. At one point, he reportedly attempted to abdicate the throne, offering to step aside in hopes of ending the conflict. But events were already spiraling beyond anyone's control. Within Rome itself, another desperate move unfolded. Sabinus, the brother of Vespasian, attempted to seize the city and bring the war to a quick end before more blood was spilled. When the situation turned against him, he retreated to the Capitoline Hill, the most sacred location in the entire city. At its summit stood the great temple of Jupiter, the religious heart of Roman power and the symbol of divine protection over the empire. Vitellius's remaining loyal forces, including his German bodyguards, surrounded the hill. The fighting that followed set the temples ablaze. Soon, the flames spread to the great temple of Jupiter itself. The structure that had stood as the spiritual center of Rome was consumed by fire, collapsing in smoke and ash. For the people watching from the streets below, the sight was terrifying. If the gods truly protected Rome, how could their greatest temple burn in the middle of a Roman civil war? To many, it felt like a terrible sign. The empire was no longer simply struggling for a new emperor. The foundations of Roman order, military discipline, civic unity, even divine favor, seemed to be collapsing all at once. And now, the armies of Vespasian were moving toward the capital itself. By late 69 AD, the Danube legions, under Antonius Primus, had reached the walls of Rome. But the city would not surrender quietly. Every street, every alley, every building had become a battlefield. The remnants of Vitellius's army and the city cohorts had turned the capital into a trap for anyone daring to enter. In the crowded streets, Roman discipline became a liability. Roof tiles rained down on advancing soldiers, arrows flew from balconies, and every corner held a potential ambush. The blood of the provinces now ran directly through the gutters of Rome as civil war came home to the heart of the empire. The fiercest fighting erupted at the Praetorian camp. The elite guards who had started the chaos by killing Galba now faced the Danube legions. They fought with a ferocity born of desperation, men who knew that surrender meant certain death. Even the hardened veterans of Vespasian's army were shocked by the intensity of their resistance. Civilians, meanwhile, seemed trapped in disbelief. Some cheered, not for one side or the other, but as if witnessing a festival of destruction, eating and drinking while their city burned. Roman society, fractured by war, was watching itself unravel. Amid the chaos, Vitellius had vanished. He did not lead his troops or defend the walls. According to accounts, he disguised himself, tying a belt of gold around his waist and hiding in a small outbuilding within the imperial palace. When scouts found him, his pleas for life were ignored. He was dragged half-naked through the Roman Forum, the same space where he had once held lavish banquets. The people who had celebrated him months before now hurled insults and filth. At the Gemonian Stairs, the execution site for criminals, he was tortured and hacked to death. His last words, directed at a mocking soldier, were simple and haunting. "Yet I was once your emperor." His body was thrown into the Tiber, a final sign that the old order had ended. Vitellius's death did not end the violence. For days, the streets ran red as victorious soldiers hunted anyone suspected of loyalty to him. Rome had become a city of corpses, a warning of what civil war could unleash. Order only returned with the arrival of Vespasian and his son, Domitian. The fourth and final emperor had claimed the throne. But the cost was immense. The Temple of Jupiter lay in ruins, thousands of soldiers were dead, and the treasury emptied. For Romans, the lesson was clear. The emperor was no god. Power belonged only to whoever commanded the strongest army. Vespasian finally sat on the throne, but he didn't inherit an empire. He inherited a crime scene. The Year of Four Emperors had revealed a harsh truth. The Roman system was broken. The secret of empire was out. Emperors could now be made in the provinces, far from the Senate and the traditions of Rome. Rome was shattered. Vespasian had to act, and he had to act visibly. He tore down Nero's golden house, a towering monument to vanity, and built the Colosseum in its place. Games and spectacles would distract a traumatized population, helping them forget the blood they had spilled on the streets. It worked, but the scars remained. Rome survived, but it was no longer a family. It had become a military state, held together by force and spectacle. Looking back on 69 AD, the cost of ego and ambition is clear. The Capitoline Hill had burned, Bedriacum had become a graveyard, and thousands of nameless soldiers lay buried in the mud. History does not care about our feelings, it cares about power. And in 69 AD, power was written in blood. If you've made it this far, congratulations. You've survived the deadliest year in Roman history. We promised a deep dive into the Year of Four Emperors, and you got every brutal, gritty detail. At Time's Battlefield, we cut through the fluff to show the tactical and human realities behind history's greatest conflicts. If this breakdown blew your mind, hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that serious history still matters. Subscribe and turn on the bell, because our next deep dive takes you even further into the front lines of history, uncovering battles you've only heard whispers about. Share this video with that friend who thinks they're a history buff but doesn't know about the night battle of Bedriacum, and drop a comment below. Who made the biggest mistake in 69 AD? Galba for being cheap, or Vitellius for being a glutton? Let's argue about it. This was Time's Battlefield. We'll see you on the next front line of history. Stay sharp.